help me work my way through a quote. And it's not a quote from you, so it may be problematic for you to help work our way through it. The quote is, federal prosecutors will have to close cases and let those criminals go. That is a quote from the President of the United States with respect to sequestration. And I'm wondering who he is talking about, those criminals, because if it's an open case in a U.S. Attorney's Office, we typically refer to those folks as defendants as opposed to criminals, don't we?
That's correct. If it's a charge case, they're a defendant.
So who are those criminals that the President was referring to when he was invoking the Hale-Bopp comet apocalypse talking about sequestration? Do you have any idea who those criminals would be?
I don't, Congressman.
I think your former colleague from the Department of Justice testified that if sequestration were to go into effect, it would take us back to 2009 funding levels. Did I hear the testimony correctly?
Yes, sir.
How many criminals were let go in 2009?
I'm not aware of criminals being let go. I wasn't in the Justice Department at the time.
How about the gentleman from the Department of Justice? Any criminals let go in 2009?
That's not something I can answer this morning, sir.
Well, I think we would have heard about it if a bunch of criminals were let go due to a lack of funding, don't you? I mean, we would need a congressional hearing for that. We would have all heard about that.
The resources that are provided to the United States Attorney's Organization influences the staffing and the prosecutors and the paralegals we have.
Well, I know that, actually, and we had furloughs in South Carolina. We had to furlough prosecutors. We had to furlough victim advocates. We had to furlough administrative assistants, investigators. Not a single solitary criminal case was closed because of those furloughs. So what I'm trying to get at is the irresponsibility of threatening, whether it's the Attorney General saying we're going to be less safe or the President saying we're going to let those criminals go because we can't survive on 2009 funding levels. So when sequester went into effect, the net result, the net impact on DOJ's budget was what, about $100 million?
The net impact of sequestration is $1.6 billion this year.
No, I'm talking about salaries and expenses. The salaries and expenses, because that's what would impact whether or not cases had to be closed and criminals let go, is about $100 million.
I would have different numbers than that. I'm not sure.
Well, let's assume for the sake of argument that I'm right. Just assume arguendo I'm right. Are you telling me there's no other place to save $100 million within DOJ's budget?
Our problem is we have to save $1.6 billion, and that will be comprised of both.
I want to focus on the U.S. Attorney's Office, that line item, salaries and expenses. Because the quote was, cases are going to be dropped and criminals are going to be let go.
From a chief financial officer perspective, this is the way I would look at the issue that you're raising this morning. When we take the sequestration cut to the U.S. Attorney's Organization, you're right, they have the ability, and frankly, they're going to have to look at taking cuts across the spectrum of their budget. That includes their personnel, their salaries, and their benefits.
What is a SALSA? What is a Special Assistant U.S. Attorney?
What's a Special Assistant Attorney?
Yeah.
That's an ordinary prosecutor is known as an Assistant United States
Right,
Attorney.
and a special would be a state prosecutor that maybe was on loan, or in some instances, some folks just volunteer to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office for the experience, and they do so for free. Agreed?
Right. You can have a special AUSA.
Okay. And they would be free in some instances.
They could be.
All right. How much did you spend on conferences last year?
How much did we spend on conferences last year? About $54 million approximately.
And how many of those conferences were for CLE credit that could not be gathered any other way than attending a conference?
I don't have that information at the table with me. We'd have to get back to you.
Can you get CLE credit so you can keep your law license via the internet?
That I don't know.
Well, you can.
Yeah.
So,
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To whom should I direct my question
about why the state of South Carolina was sued for its efforts to assist in immigration enforcement,
That would be a civil division matter.
and why was the state of South Carolina sued for trying to do what the federal government has been woefully inadequate at doing. In fact, we've had hearing after hearing where immigration enforcement officials have come and said they're overworked and underpaid and a whole litany of reasons why they can't do it. And then a state wants to assist and they wind up being sued, which is not an infrequent occurrence with my state. I think we have 3 current lawsuits that the Department of Justice has filed against us. So why don't you want our help with immigration enforcement?
I think, Congressman, the federal government certainly looks for and relies on the assistance of states in enforcing the immigration laws, and that's been reflected in the policy statements of the government and in the pleadings that have been filed in that case. But when the state crosses from cooperation with federal law and federal priorities into creating, in effect, a state-level immigration policy, that's where the government concluded the constitutional violation occurred, and that.
But when states pass guest worker laws on their own, you don't sue them.
Well, Congressman, in the state of Utah, that's one that I'm aware of.
Have you filed suit in the state of Utah?
We have filed suit in the state of Utah, though not against the guest worker program, because it doesn't go into effect until 2013. But we have told the state of Utah that, in our view, that provision of the state law is preempted because it conflicts with federal law, and that if it remains on the books at the time that it's scheduled to go into effect next year, we would be prepared to take action at that time.
We have concurrent jurisdiction in drug cases, agreed?
That's my understanding.
We have concurrent jurisdiction in bank robbery cases. The good ones go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the ones that are tougher to prove go to the state DA's office, right?
Again, that's my general understanding.
When a stop and rob is robbed, it could be a Hobbs Act case if the United States Attorney's Office wants to take it, or it could just be a garden variety common law robbery case in state court. Right. We've had hearing after hearing, and I don't even want to get into administrative amnesty by memo. They say they don't have the tools, they don't have the workers, they don't have the time, they're having to prioritize who's removed, where it's enforced, where it's not enforced. I would just think that you would welcome the help from states. And it just doesn't seem like that's the case.
Well, Congressman, again, I think the federal government does welcome and does work closely with states in immigration.
You can understand how the filing of a suit against a state might lead that state to conclude otherwise.
I think, Congressman, here the situation was, as I indicated, that after careful review, the government concluded that in the case of South Carolina and some other states, that by creating a state-level immigration policy in an area that the Constitution reserves to the federal government and creating a patchwork of immigration laws, that not only conflicted with the constitutional structure, but would be.
And you're basing it on what portion of the Constitution do you read as giving exclusive? You talking about Article 1, Section 8, where it says the process of naturalization? Is there another basis for it?
I think and other enumerated authorities related to foreign affairs. I think the Supreme Court has recognized that immigration is because it's connected closely to foreign affairs, is an area of federal authority.
To whom should I direct my questions about Medicare and Medicaid fraud?
That would also be me, Congressman.
How many, in the last 12 months, how many active prison sentences have been meted out for Medicaid or Medicare fraud?
I'm sorry, prison sentence?
Active prison sentences, not fines, not corporate, don't do it again, active prison sentences.
Right. I don't know that number, Congressman,
Yes.
but we could certainly.
Round number.
I'm sorry, I don't have that
10,
on.
100?
Unfortunately, Congressman, I can't speculate. I'm happy to get back to you with.
Do you know how many times you filed a motion for upward departure in those sentencing hearings to try to send an even clearer message?
I don't, Congressman.
Would you be willing to give me that information?
To the extent that we can identify it, we'll certainly get back to you.
Well, you would know. I mean, I assume you're a supervisor in the department. You have to approve motions for upward departure, don't you?
I think it depends, but actually I think usually those have not come to me, at least in my experience.
Are you familiar with the Texas orthodontia fraud case?
Not specifically.
There was more money given out in the state of Texas for orthodontists, and I'm not aware of any study that shows there's more crooked teeth in Texas than there is any other state, but more money was doled out in Texas than all other states combined. In fact, they were advertising free braces. Far be it from me to tell the Bureau or anyone else where they ought to look, but that just strikes me as a case that probably wouldn't be that tough to prove. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.